Okay, so everybody sees the homework assignment, right? Everybody's got this. All right, so the way I want to start our classes from now on, there's a tradition in parliamentary governments that are based on the British model called question time. And it's essentially 15 minutes every day when the Prime Minister is supposed to field questions from members of the Parliament. Now, usually, this is a way that members of the opposition party grandstand and try to catch either try to promote their own programs or try to catch the Prime Minister in a lie or an evasion. But we're not going to be doing that, right? And we're not going to be doing this for 15 minutes. I just want to take the first couple minutes of every class to answer any questions that you guys have about the homework or about the course material or any other issues that you're having with the class that you feel like raising. So take a minute, think about, I know I just kind of sprang this on you now and you weren't aware we were going to be doing this. So take a minute, think about whether you have any questions or not, and feel free to ask them. Right? And remember that no question is trivial. Right? No question is trivial, no question is stupid. The stupider thing is to have a question and not to ask it.
How long do you want this assignment to be? I know last assignment you were like, this needs to be 500 words.
Yeah. And yeah, I was 500 words for this one too, right? So unless I say otherwise, the minimum is 500 words, right? Now I realize I also didn't impose a maximum on the last one. I'm going to do that from now on. If you are writing less than 500 words, you're not saying enough. If you are writing more than 750, you are saying too much, right? You're biting off more than you can chew. So, yeah, make 750 the upper limit, right? It's not always better to write more. Sometimes what you want to do is stay small and focused, right? In particular in these early assignments, what we're trying to do is stay focused on small pieces of text and short pieces of writing. But yes, yes, good question. Any other questions about anything?
Are we going to review the homework, not everyone's individual work, but as a group talk about what we read and what we got from it and stuff, and see where that differs?
Yes, we will do that. Yes.
We're all on the same page.
Well, you know what though, it's okay if you're not, right? The fact is, with just about any text you read, there's going to be more than one valid interpretation, right? Now, as long as you're kind of getting the basic gist of what Seneca's argument is correct, then that's what we want to do, right? Excuse me a second here. Beer here in my mask. Always inconvenient. As long as you are getting the gist of, as long as you're getting the basic argument right, you're all going to have probably different emphases, right? Different things that you chose to focus on. And that's great because that actually means that we'll get a fuller picture of the essay through discussion.
How long does it normally take you to grade these assignments, depending on when they're turned in?
If you turn them in, so if they're turned in tonight, I will grade them during my office hours tomorrow.
Okay.
Yeah, I usually, particularly with these shorter assignments, I usually try to have a pretty quick turnaround. In part because I feel like, the feedback will benefit you as you do the future assignments, and I want you to have that quickly. And also just because it's not nice to keep you hanging.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Okay, other than like essays and things like that, are we gonna be reading like speeches and like different type of stories?
Yeah, so we're not going to be reading too much like fiction or poetry in this class, though we will be using samples of it here and there. We are going to be reading in a couple of weeks a speech from an ancient Greek play. We are also going to be reading some examples of, I guess we're not really reading any speech, we are going to be reading some rhetorical pieces. We're going to be looking at Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, among other things. Audre Lorde's argument against silence, things of that nature. So we'll be looking at things in a couple of different genres. It won't all be quite as dry as Seneca.
No, not dry.
I know, like,
Whatever.
I know we all like move at a different pace when we're doing our homework and stuff, but like,
Mhm.
do you have like, just so I can get an idea of how long this should be taking me? Like, what did you have in mind, like how long an assignment, like how long would it take us to do this?
Yeah.
If you could put a number to it, I know. Like,
Yeah, I can't really put a number to it because I don't know everyone's process. I don't know, like some people are faster writers, some people are slower writers. Like I will say that it's generally a good idea to start early, right? To start once you have the assignment, and maybe if you have the time, break it up over a couple of days. And this is not just to give yourself more time to get it done, but it's also because we tend to do better thinking when we do our thinking slowly. And what I mean by this is that if you give your focused attention to something for a short period of time, and then go off and do something else, right? You will often develop ideas about what you've been doing or about what you've been reading while you're not actively engaged with it, right? So, say you sit down and you read a few paragraphs of Seneca and you pay really, really close, intense attention to it, and then you get up and you go do your laundry or make yourself dinner or something, right? And while you're doing those other things, right, Seneca's still boiling on the back burner of your brain. And a lot of our best insights actually kind of come passively like that when we're not trying to force them. It's also often not a bad idea if you've got a particularly difficult homework assignment to start it before bed and then finish it when you get up in the morning. Like, do the reading before bed, go to sleep, and then when you wake up, you will often have fresh ideas.
I know for me, I get really burnt out with writing. Like, I'll be writing, I'll be good pace, and then poof, writer's block. So
yeah,
I'll
and
have to like drop it for the day.
yeah, and the best thing to do in those cases is, again, not to force it, right? Go do something else for a while. Ideas will come to you. I know, again, that sounds like hippy-dippy mystical shit, and it's really not, right? There's solid psychological backing to all of this. This is really how our brains work. Okay, any other questions? Okay. Then let's do our little bit of close reading practice for the day. I'm going to put up a quote on the screen here. And I'm going to want you, once I can get this damn thing to cooperate, to try to answer a couple of questions about it. All right, so first, what is the literal situation being described? And what issue is under debate. In this situation.
What's the quote from?
It is from the first chapter of The Hobbit. I also want you to, as usual, look for patterns of repetition and contrast. Right? Are there words, phrases, or images that repeat? Are there things that seem to be set up as opposites to one another? And I also want you to think about what assumptions, right? What unstated ideas or premises underlie the argument or arguments in the piece. So this is something you can only answer really when you've done the other work, right? So take your time with it, look this over, and see if you can figure out what's going on here. At least for now, pay more attention to the first two paragraphs. So have you guys been able to make any progress with the first two questions here?
Yeah.
Okay, so what's the literal situation here being described?
Bilbo is questioning / pointing out that good morning could mean anything. Like he's asking, well, what do you mean by good morning? Do you mean good morning, or is it a good morning, or whatever?
Yeah, so Bilbo says good morning to Gandalf, and he meant it, right? But what does Gandalf's response indicate?
He didn't get it.
Yeah, that it's not exactly clear to him what it is, right? He's not exactly clear on what the meaning is of good morning. So what's the issue under debate here?
What Bilbo was implying by saying good morning.
Yeah, what exactly does good morning mean here, right? So then is there a larger issue here being debated that is related to this dispute over what good morning might mean?
He might be having a bad morning, so like when someone, if you're in a crappy mood and someone comes up and says, good morning, and you look like, is it really a good morning?
I think you're on the right track here. I think, does the quote here give us enough information to determine what anyone's mood is?
No.
Not
It just
really,
seems like
right?
he's overthinking it.
I guess you could assume that Bilbo was in a better mood than Gandalf.
Mm-hmm.
Because I would assume that if you're in I guess in a better mood, Gandalf wouldn't have questioned it as much. He would have just didn't just reply with good morning and went on. But
Well, let's take mood and feelings out of it and just kind of focus on what they both say, right? What were you going to say?
I would say maybe Bilbo could have been more specific in what he was saying from the get-go. He didn't have to just fit whatever all of those things can mean into one statement. He could have.
Yeah.
I can't remember the word for it,
Yeah, Bilbo is making an assumption here, right? He's assuming that the meaning of his language is clear, right? And Gandalf is pointing out that, in fact, it's not, right? So the point of debate here, right, is essentially, it's essentially about the nature of language, right? They're arguing about the nature of language. Have we noticed any patterns of repetition or contrast here?
He says good morning a lot.
Okay, yeah, good morning repeats quite a bit, right? This is the phrase, the meaning of which is at issue, right? Anything else you see that repeats?
The word it.
Okay. Is it necessarily an important one, though?
I don't know, I just see that it
I would
repeats.
say mean.
Okay, yeah, mean, right?
Mean that is a good morning.
Yeah, I think, yeah, mean is probably the most important repetition in the whole quote, right? Because that is the point over which they're arguing, right? Is this point of meaning. So, good morning, said Bilbo, and he meant it. What do you mean? He said. And now later on here we can see that Gandalf has been good morninged again, but Bilbo made his meaning more clear in the second situation. In the novel, Bilbo says good morning, we don't want any adventures here, and turns around and starts ignoring Gandalf. So in this case, he's made his intentions clear, and Gandalf states, right, now you mean that you want to get rid of me, and then it won't be a good morning till I move off. But up here, Bilbo is assuming his intentions are clear when they are not. So, as far as the assumptions underlying this exchange go, right? So, what assumption, again, is Bilbo making about the nature of language? What is he assuming is true about his language in particular?
That everyone understands it.
Yeah, that it's perfectly clear, it's perfectly transparent, everybody gets it, right? When I say good morning, you should just know what I mean. And Gandalf is undermining that theory of language, right? That idea of language by pointing out that unless you show me what your intention is, it is not at all clear what you mean. Until you do something like turn your back on me to show what you mean by good morning, I won't know what it is you mean by good morning. So what we have here, the reason I wanted to look at this quote and close read this quote today in particular is because it sets up for us two different theories of language, right? So Bilbo is here a representative of what linguists and philosophers call the transparent theory of language. So according to this particular theory, words are just stand-ins or substitutes for concepts or things. And the connection between language and its objects is clear and obvious. Hence transparent. Right. When I say good morning, everybody should understand what the hell that means, right? I said good morning and I meant it. Now Gandalf, on the other hand, is arguing for what is called the constitutive theory of language. And what this theory states is that language is actually slippery and ambiguous. That we can't really determine what a word means without context, right? Meaning depends on context, right? I can't read your intention until I have a context for what you said. And that rather than simply describing things in the world, language constructs the world that we live in. Right? As the only means that we have at our disposal for describing things or for communicating with each other effectively. Language doesn't just describe the world, it actually makes it, right? What we can say about the world is largely determined by our language, right? By our vocabularies. So language kind of mediates our experience with the rest of the world, right? Does this make sense, everybody? Does everybody get me? Okay. So to give you an example of this, in the textbook on page 40, they give us a number of examples of ambiguous phrases. Right, so if we just turn here, I just want to focus for a second on a couple of my favorites here. Right. Local high school dropouts cut in half. And when making cookies, include your kids. So, why are these two phrases ambiguous? What's going on here? Let's look at the first one first. Local high school dropouts cut in half. What two things could that mean?
They were literally cutting out.
Yeah, that you took local people who dropped out of high school and punished them for doing so by cutting them in half, right? Or, what does it more likely mean if we're thinking about this in the context of a newspaper headline?
Probably the numbers of the high school dropouts are cut in half.
Yeah, the local high school has cut its number of dropouts in half. As fewer people are dropping out of high school. But the way the writer of the headline has framed this is ambiguous enough that it could mean either of those things, right? What about the second one? When making cookies, include your kids.
Do you want that, like the actual meaning, or what it could mean?
Well, I mean, they're both valid meanings, right, of the phrase.
One could be like your kids an ingredient, or one
Or make it with your kids.
Yeah, we can probably assume, again, if this is something published in a newspaper, that they're not going to advocate like cutting up and eating your children, or like substituting child chips for butterscotch in the cookies area, right?
That one kid, Mama, you better not cook me now.
like newspaper editors and writers, do you think they use like ambiguous things like that to get people to read? Like, I guess you would use, like, they would use language like that to get people to pick it up so they can read it.
Yeah, and there are definitely some newspapers that have a history of engaging in that kind of sensationalism. Like, there's a famous New York Post headline from, I think, the 1980s about a murder in a strip club.
Okay.
And it's headless body in topless bar.
I'm so sorry, I have a really dark sense of humor, so this is hilarious.
But it is also, again, playing on a kind of ambiguity, right? That there are two kinds of topless being described in the headline, right? It's talking about a strip club, but it's also talking about someone who has been decapitated. So yes, this is dark, this is a little morbid, it's a little bit sordid, right? But they're still, like, what they're trying to do is give you that uncomfortable laugh, right? So you pick up the paper. I think in these cases, it was more likely accidental and just kind of sloppy editing. To give you another example of that kind of thing, my wife's cousin, when she was 14, did a charity jump rope-a-thon. Her heart was in the right place. She meant well. She was trying to raise money to dig wells in rural villages in Africa. However, the flyer that she sent around to raise money said this: jumps for joy, leaving a footprint on a child's heart. Now, what she's trying to do is play on the idea of jumping rope, right? And your foot making an impact every time it hits the ground.
Or apparently in a child's heart.
Yeah, well, also kind of like leaving a mark, right, in the child's life, right? So it's clever on that level, right? But what she didn't think about is, what does this actually sound like?
You're stomping.
That you're stomping on a kid's heart, right? So these are just some examples of the way language often gets away from us, right? And we always need to consider the multiple possible meanings of words and how we need to think about context as determining meaning. So one of the ways that we think about meaning, right, is by trying to, or that we tease out potential meanings or ambiguities in language is by thinking about synonyms, right? So what is a synonym?
Words that have similar meanings, different words that have similar meanings.
Yeah, they have similar meanings, right?
I was like, I'm thinking of the food. I'm looking like, how
Oh,
does
you're thinking of cinnamon. Yes.
Yeah, I
yes,
was looking
yeah.
like, I'm so sorry, y'all. I'm kind
It's because I mentioned cookies earlier. It's all right, but yeah. So yes, I think it's good that you mentioned words with similar meanings. Synonyms don't mean the same thing, right? Language tends to be pretty efficient, and we drop words that we don't need. So even words that might literally refer to the same thing will often have a different range of associations, right? Or will be used in different contexts. So to give you an example, do these words mean the same thing? Do they refer to the same body function? They do, right? But they don't mean the same thing, right? Because we don't use them in the same contexts. And each of these words has a different history that has determined the context in which we use it, right? So example, the first word, shit, right? Yes, it refers again to a body function, but it also is something that you might say if you wake up at night and you're stumbling around in the dark and you stub your toe on the foot of the bed or something, right? You wouldn't say, oh, defecate or oh, bowel movement. Shit is also a word that we tend to regard as vulgar, right? It's not something that we tend to say in polite society. It's something that we often let slip out by accident rather than something that we say consciously. Now, what about defecate? What are the proper contexts for that word? Yes. I defecated, yes, in my trousers. Yes, that's really good. But it's defecate is a more clinical kind of term, right? It's a more kind of scientific, technical kind of word. You wouldn't. It's not something we tend to use in casual conversation, right? And bowel movements is a polite euphemism that avoids referring to the thing itself by referring to what a particular part of your body does to expel that thing, right? So you reference the body part and what it's doing rather than the actual function. So you're kind of dancing around what's actually happening. So this one's vulgar, this one's scientific, this one's a polite euphemism. And the way we use each of these words, as I said, is determined by history and by word origins. Shit is one of the oldest words in the English language. It comes directly from Anglo-Saxon, which is the ancestor language of English. Right? You can't, if you see a page of Anglo-Saxon, it's, with the exception of certain words that haven't changed, like shit, it's no longer readable to a speaker of modern English. Right? They're not mutually intelligible. Anglo-Saxon looks more like German. But it's the direct ancestor of modern English. Defecate comes from Latin, as is the case with most of our scientific and technical terms. And bowel movement comes from French. Now, how would these Latin and French words have gotten into English? Does anybody know? Or can guess?
Probably just trying to expand English, translating, possibly.
Okay.
I'm probably far left off field.
Yeah. How else might these have gotten into English? Let's think about if we know anything about medieval Europe. What do we know about the status of Latin in the Middle Ages? Who would have spoken Latin in Europe in the Middle Ages? You're making the right first sound there. Ch, ch, ch.
How?
You just gotta add something to finish the word. It starts with ch.
Chinese.
No.
You might just have to go for it,
Yeah, it was the language of the Catholic Church, which was the only church in Western Europe, right, in the Middle Ages. So because certain churchmen were basically the only people in Europe who could read and write, Latin becomes then the kind of international language of scholarship, right? So scholars and teachers throughout Europe all write and speak Latin. And so much of the technical vocabulary that we still have in English is drawn from Latin. Now, what about French? How might French have gotten into English? I don't know how much any of you know about British history. I'm going to assume not much because that's usually the case in my Comp 2 classes, but correct me if I'm wrong. Does anybody know what happened in England in 1066?
Was the like the breakup of the church, like the Protestant movement?
No, that came along much later. The Protestant Reformation started in Germany in the late 15th century. 1066 was the year in which England was invaded by warriors from northern France called the Normans. The Normans won, the Normans took over, and then they become the upper class, right? They become the new aristocracy in England. And the English, the Anglo-Saxons, become a kind of underclass. So what this means is that if we look at what this means for language, right, is if we look at modern English, a lot of our words that are associated with elite culture in various ways are drawn from French. Our words in the realms of fashion, cooking, not because the Normans would have been doing the cooking, but because they would have been doing the eating. Law. Right? Even a lot of our military terms. If you look at military ranks in English-speaking armies, general, marshal, captain, lieutenant, corporal, right? Those are words of French origin. And indeed, our polite euphemisms have their origins in French because this was for a long time the language of the upper class. And so, poor Anglo-Saxon becomes a vulgar peasant language. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong or evil about the word shit, right? We consider it impolite, but if, I stand up here and say shit, like as I've done several times now today, as I do several times virtually every day, I haven't been struck by lightning, right? A pit has not opened up in the ground to swallow me up. The dean hasn't come in to fire me. In fact, I could spend 45 minutes each class period just tap dancing up here saying shitty shit, 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 right?
You still get paid.
Yeah, I've got tenure, so I'm hard to fire. So yeah, I could do that. I won't because it would be extremely irresponsible and it would be a waste of your time and money. But my point is that there's no particular reason inherent in the word why we consider shit a bad word. The reason we consider it vulgar is because it was a peasant word for a body function, right? So, a word spoken by people of the lower classes becomes a low class or impolite word, right? Does this make sense?
Does it have to do with all cuss words or just that one that we're talking about?
Most of what we consider cuss words or vulgar words in English, yeah. This is basically what happened, yeah. I'm going to give you another quick example of how this worked, right? So I'm going to put a list of French animal names, or French-derived animal words, and English-derived animal words, and you tell me what the difference is. So these are the French words. These are the English words. What's the difference?
One is describing them as what they are in food form.
Uh-huh.
The other is what we call them as animals.
Yeah.
While they're still alive.
Yeah. Yeah. On the right we have the animal, or our name for the animal. On the left we have our name for the meat that comes from the animal. Now, why are all the names for the meat derived from French, while the names for the animal are derived from English?
It fits in that polite euphemism. Well, it seems that, you know, and then like when people, you know, some people get squeamish when you talk about, you know, where some of the meat comes from.
Yeah, like we live, and this is kind of a general thing about contemporary culture, is that we live at a much greater remove from death and violence typically than our ancestors did, right? You know, we often don't have to face what the thing we're eating used to be. We just go to we just go to Food Line and there it is shrink wrapped in the freezer section, right? But what's going on here, right, is that the English peasant raised the animal for the French lord's table, right? So that's why the name for the meat comes from the French word from the animal, right? You know, French bœuf is simply a bull. French mouton is simply a sheep, right? But in English, this is how it now translates. So much of the language we use is shaped by history in a variety of ways, right? Now let's look at words that we actually do tend to use to mean more or less the same thing, and try to pull those apart and show why maybe we shouldn't. So, do we tend to use in everyday conversation the words prejudice, discrimination, and racism to mean the same thing? Yeah, in casual conversation we typically do, right? But sociologists and psychologists in particular do not, legal theorists also do not use them to mean the same thing, right?
Because they all have different meanings depending on how you're talking about it.
Yeah, they all really do mean different things, right? So there's a common thread that runs through them, right? But they all refer to something slightly different, right? The gradations are a little bit subtle. If we're talking about prejudice, what are we talking about?
Like a group, like you're being, I guess, rude to a group of people. Like it's not talking about an individual person, it's like a group.
Yeah, so it's a feeling you have about a group, right? So does prejudice, does the fact that you feel prejudice toward a particular group necessarily mean you do anything about that prejudice? Often you will, right? Usually people do, right? But prejudice itself refers only to a feeling, right? A kind of personal attitude towards a particular group, right? So like if I say like I don't like people with red hair, right? Then I am generalizing about a whole group of people, right? I have this general dislike, this personal dislike for a particular group for arbitrary reasons. Now then, what is discrimination? How is discrimination different from prejudice?
Normally you act on that feeling.
Yeah, discrimination is the action associated with prejudice, right? To discriminate is to act against. Members of a particular group. So, like, say I won't, say I have, 2 applicants for a job. I'm deciding who gets that job. And I see that the 2 applicants are of different races, and I choose not to hire one of those applicants because of their race, then I'm committing an act of discrimination, right? So prejudice and discrimination are both kind of on the personal level, right? The level of personal feeling and personal action. What about racism? How is racism different from these other 2 terms? What do we mean when we talk about racism?
It has to do with their skin color. It's like primarily just their skin color, like having a thing against.
Okay, it is often primarily based on issues of race, which but is also race is a cultural construct, and there is no biological difference, right, between people of different races. In fact, most people, if you look far back enough in their family history, most people would be of mixed race. But race is constructed by a culture, right? Ideas of race are constructed by a culture. But when we talk about racism, what we're talking about is a legal system. That advantages one group over others.
Can you elaborate on that?
So for example, let's go back to our model of somebody who is deciding which person gets a job, right? If that person chooses not to hire a person of a different race from themselves on the basis of personal feeling, then they're acting according to prejudice. If they're acting on the basis of law that says they are not supposed to hire a person of a particular race, then they are discriminating on the basis of racism, right? So when we talk about racism, we're talking about a whole system of laws that are set up to give one group of people an advantage and to put other people at a disadvantage, right? And these often don't necessarily, like, racist laws don't always involve specific mention of race. For example, certain laws for a while that dictated what sorts of buildings could be built in particular neighborhoods were often worded in ways that were designed to keep black people from buying houses in those neighborhoods, even if it didn't specifically say in the law, black people aren't allowed to buy houses in this neighborhood, right? Lending laws were sometimes set up to advantage certain people over others, right? So the big thing that I'm trying to get at here, right, is that even though we tend to use these 3 words interchangeably, they don't refer to the same phenomenon, right? They're all related in that they refer to actions or feelings against a particular people based on race. But these 2 are on the level of the personal, and this is on the level of systems that are throughout a society, right? So you could think of, like, say like the Jim Crow laws, right, as being an explicitly racist legal system, right? When, by law, people are not allowed to use the same bathrooms or the same water fountains, right? Okay, so any questions about any of this so far?
So it basically Like they're all different, but in a way they tie into each other.
Yeah, they're all related to each other, right? They're closely related enough, particularly in the public imagination, right? That we do tend to use them in conversation as synonyms. But the larger point that I'm trying to make here is the same one that I'm trying to make here, right? That these words are all, even though these words all mean the same thing, they're applicable in different contexts. Whereas we tend to use these words in very similar contexts, but they don't all mean the same thing, right? So the basic thing that I'm trying to point out is that there is no such thing as a real synonym. However, trying to replace given words with synonyms can often reveal to us things about the writer's thinking, right? Can often help us to pull out assumptions that the writer is making. So let me give you an example of this. Actually, if you turn to page 47 in Writing Analytically, there are a couple of examples. That we can use to try to paraphrase. I just want to work with one or two of these a little bit. Let's start with the first one here. The 6 most dangerous words in the English language. I am entitled to my opinion. So the first thing we need to do is isolate what we think the key meaning-bearing words are in this statement. What do you think are the key words here?
My opinion.
Okay, my is important and I, right? Opinion is important. And entitled, right? So what we then want to try to do is think up as many synonyms as we can for each of these key meaning-bearing words, right? Now we can already see that it's going to be hard to do that for one set of words here, right? Which words are going to be hardest to find synonyms for? I and mine, yeah. It's really, really hard to think of another way to say that, right? So what does that in and of itself tell us is central to the meaning of the sentence?
Significantly about that person or I.
Yeah, that it's very much about like the individual I here, right? Very much about like the individual or the self, right? Okay, good. So see what you can do then with entitled and opinion. And try to think about the range of meanings that a word like entitled might have, right? What other things might this word mean in other contexts that might still shape the way we read it? And whenever you feel like you have something, just feel free to speak up.
First thing I think of is deserving.
Okay.
It kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
Too after it, but.
But yeah, like I deserve my opinion, right? How is the word deserve related to the word entitled? How are they similar to each other?
Someone's entitled, they feel like they deserve that thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, something you deserve is something that's owed to you, right? Something that you're entitled to. If you're entitled to something, is that something that someone can take away from you? Yeah, if you feel you're entitled to something, or if you're legally entitled to something, right? then yeah, nobody can take this away from you. Can you think of other synonyms for entitled?
It would like rearrange the sentence like I have a right, like a right.
Okay. I have a right to my opinion. Again, the sense of right being something that we are legally owed, right? That are legally ours, that people can't take from us. What about opinion? How might we rephrase opinion?
You could say views.
Okay, my views, yes. I am entitled to my views. I have a right to my views. I deserve my views.
Thoughts?
Thoughts? Okay, good. What else? Ideas?
I would say point of view, but I feel like since we already got views, it wouldn't really. It
Okay.
would just be reiterating.
Yeah. Well, point of view is actually different from, like, point of view is like a perspective, right? So I'm entitled to my perspective, I'm entitled to my point of view. So how are these things like opinions? Views, thoughts, ideas, perspective.
Everyone has, everyone has different opinions, views, thoughts, ideas, and perspective.
Okay, yeah, these are all things that are personal, right? Yeah. Yeah, they're all personal, they're all subjective, right? How else are these things similar?
Probably like definition wise, they all have the same, they're all defined the same way, maybe.
Well, that's what I'm trying to get at, is like how the definitions of these words would be similar, right?
Oh, I see what you're asking.
What do they all relate to? I know, it's hard to find another word, right? Yeah. I mean, well, one of the reasons why this exercise is useful is because it's hard, right? And it makes us think a lot about the language choices we make.
But they can come up with like your mind, like
Yeah, they all refer to the mind, right?
Not really about to go out.
Well, just hang on for another 15 minutes or so, okay?
I was just saying, I didn't notice, it's like,
So we have here a sentence strongly focused on the individual mind, right? And someone saying that they believe that they deserve or that they are entitled to what's in their mind, right? So, does this sound like an open or closed kind of situation?
closed.
Why would you say it sounds like a more closed kind of situation?
Because, you can't really take someone's opinion away from them as their opinion.
That's basically what it says. Like, you're like, you can't change my mind, right?
Right.
Because I'm entitled to my opinion, you can't change my mind. So it's inherently defensive, right? You've probably heard somebody say this to you in an argument before, right? When somebody says, I'm entitled to my opinion, this usually means that they refuse to talk about it anymore, right? And that they're telling you that you're not going to change their mind. And the way this is phrased suggests that you owe it to them somehow to leave their minds unchanged, right? that they're owed their opinion.
Just believe him, how they are. Not trying to.
Yeah, exactly. It's an expression of resistance to being changed, right?
Which is sad.
Yeah, there's one of my favorite, my personal favorite quotes. It comes from an essay by Ralph Waldo Emerson, who I usually think is full of shit. But there is one particular quote. He says, "A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds." So basically what he's talking about there, right, is clinging to an idea even after it's been disproved, right? Just for the sake of being consistent. And the person who continues to say, "I'm entitled to my opinion," is doing exactly that, right? It's like, I'm not going to listen to anything you have to say because I have a right to have my mind left unchanged.
I feel like also within an argument, that's kind of the last resort you'll go to to try to, one, close the argument, but also you can't defend it anymore. You're like, oh, it's my opinion, just leave it.
Yeah, it is also a defensive way of conceding defeat, right?
Yeah.
It's saying that you're not going to change your mind, but also saying that I don't have any better arguments, right?
That's how I see it, you know.
Okay, so we are running, speaking of, we are running a little bit short on time here. So there is one more thing that I want to talk a little bit about today, right? And then, which is also related to this larger issue of theories of language that we're talking about, particularly this constitutive theory of language. I hope by now we've demonstrated that the transparent theory of language is largely bullshit, and that the constitutive theory of language much more accurately describes reality, right? So I want to leave you with a brief discussion of what philosophers of language call speech act theory. And the basic tenet of speech act theory is, again, that language actually performs actions in the world, right? That we actually speak certain things in certain conditions into existence, right? So each phrase or utterance has three parts. The first we call the locutionary act. This is simply what is said. The illocutionary act is what is intended. Within the locutionary act. And the perlocutionary act is what is done as a result of the speech act, right?
Is that perlocutionary?
Perlocutionary, yes. I'm saying, let me make that a little bit more clear. And of course I can. So to give you an example, let's say that we are sitting at a table having a meal, and I ask, is there any salt? That's the locutionary act, right? That's what I said. What's the illocutionary act? What do I intend by asking, is there any salt? Yeah, I want you to give me some salt, right? And then the perlocutionary act, if you correctly discern my intention, is that you pass me the salt, right? So every utterance, every speech act has what is called illocutionary force. And of course, my marker is dying, probably because I pressed too hard on the board. All right, and this is the force of the intention behind the utterance, right? So this is what Gandalf is asking Bilbo about in the quote that we were looking at the beginning of class, right? Bilbo makes a locutionary act. He says, "Good morning." And Gandalf asks, "What do you mean?" Because the illocutionary force of Bilbo's speech act is not clear. So the illocutionary force is always the intention behind a given speech act. And we find that some speech acts actually do affect the world and people's lives in specific and concrete ways, right? So, for example, when the preacher or the justice of the peace says, "By the power vested in me by the state of Georgia, I now pronounce you married," right? That changes your relationship both to the state and to another person. When an elected official, whether it's the president or a senator or the dog catcher, takes the oath of office, when they have finished that particular locutionary act, their status is different, right? Their status is changed. Okay, you were John Smith, candidate for office, you got the most votes, you've taken the oath now you're John Smith, senator, right? What was the other one? When a relative dies, they leave behind a will, right? And that will, right, that speech act, that act in language, explains how they want their goods distributed among their descendants, right, or among their survivors. So speech acts not only have to have their intentions determined by context, right, but also do have a genuine and concrete impact on everything around us. Right? We do make the world out of language. Right? Legal systems are constructed out of language. Everything you're doing in all of your classes and most of the things you're going to be doing in your jobs after you graduate, it's all constructed out of language. So the better you are able to harness and master language, the better you will be able to navigate the adult world, right? So, does anybody have any questions about any of this? We're going to be developing some of this stuff a little further next time. Does anybody have any questions about anything at all before I let you go? I always make the mistake of saying before I let you go, because then you know that we're done. And you won't have any questions because you just want to go home.
I got another class.
Okay, so we'll leave it there. Remember, assignment 1 on Seneca is due tonight, along with any vocabulary words. If you have any questions, shoot me an email, and I'll see you on Thursday.
Do we just submit the